So Space Marines might be getting a little bit less value out of their cover saves, and dense cover in Warhammer 40k seems to be history. Let's talk about a rather big terrain preview laying out the rules for battlefields in 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking terrain in 10th, and Games Workshop has given us a rather big preview laying out all the major rules for the biggest terrain types. It's not 100% of the picture, but it looks like it's the majority of it. And overall, what changes there are do seem sensible. For the most part, it's a pared down version of 9th edition, keeping a lot of the stuff that's good, but also cutting out some major parts. Terrain rules have certainly waxed and waned in power over the last few years in 40k. I must admit, one criticism that quite a lot of people had of 8th edition of the game was that the terrain rules were super weak. A lot of the time it just meant that armies wouldn't get enormous amounts of protection, even if they happened to have relatively heavy terrain on their side of the board. And with Games Workshop's terrain often having lots of decorative windows in it, all that you got from the terrain was still just a +1 to your armor saves, and it wasn't actually all that much protection against being shot off the board very early. Really not so good if you're playing a melee army and trying to close in on a gun line. It meant that if you were trying to play more balanced tournament games in 8th edition 40k, you often had to choose to either use terrain that deliberately had no windows or gaps in it, that would help protect players' armies, make sure they're not just alpha struck off the board, and provide some semblance of balance between melee and shooting. Or you could, as the ITC did, house rule things like ground floor ruins block line of sight, a pretty decent patch that Games Workshop kind of wound up copying slightly, with the introduction of obscuring ruins in 9th. 9th edition 40k did change terrain rules really quite a lot. I'd say obscuring terrain was probably the single best change though. It meant that you could actually reliably hide a decent chunk of your army behind terrain bits, and then it meant that you have a little bit more tactical play rather than just getting shot at different ranges. It was always a bit of a feels bad when you get shot through a tiny window from half the battlefield away. Just doesn't really feel all that cinematic. It also introduced things like dense cover for a -1 to hit in forests, and I did quite like that they actually had some sort of guide as to roughly how much terrain a 9th edition game of 40k was ideally balanced around. It really helped to standardise expectations for what you should have for a game, and again I think this did help the balance between range and melee. Still though, I do think that you could make a fair few criticisms of 9th terrain rules. Probably the biggest one is just how badly written they are, at least in my opinion. When they came out, they had a whole load of people arguing them one way or the other. Eventually the community got round to passing them and things were generally agreed, but for any new player starting to try and learn the game, I must admit it was very hard to understand them, and I'd say particularly the rules around obscuring cover and dense cover were perhaps some of the worst. Easy causes of confusion that at least a lot of new players didn't initially get. It was maybe just a bit debatable as well as to what sort of terrain traits would apply to different terrain. Games Workshop did leave things a little bit freeform with that, something that they seem to have tried to address here. Moving into 10th edition though, and we've got a fair few updates to how terrain and scenery works, and perhaps one of the biggest and most obvious is that dense cover just seems to be history, no more -1 to hit in woods and things, and it looks like they've also removed a few combat orientated terrain benefits such as heavy cover and setting to defend. The standard benefit of cover, which is currently called light cover, that has been slightly worsened for Space Marines, specifically for save 3+ units against AP0 attacks. Maybe not awesome news for power armoured armies. And beyond that, the terrain traits have been simplified and a few rules tweaked. They do say in the article that the previous rules were just a little bit on the heavy-handed side with how many words and rules could be applied to one single piece. They've now tried to keep things a bit more simple and intuitive, with just 6 major classes of terrain: craters, barricades, debris, hills, woods and ruins. Let's talk about all these new pieces and changes and how it might impact the game. First up, dense cover going I think might not be the worst thing for 40k. In 9th edition it's been -1 to hit through woods and similar pieces of terrain like that, and I'd argue that it was handed out kind of weirdly, very easy for things like big models and vehicles to get. All you had to do was tow into a piece of that terrain and you get it, but a bit harder for big units and infantry squads and things, where if just one model was exposed and wouldn't be getting this, then all the rest of the unit wouldn't get it either. I feel like the wording on handing it out was perhaps particularly painful, all about drawing a 1mm thick line to every part of the enemy model's base. I feel like that was a rule that took a bit of a double take when people first read it. I feel like perhaps having -1 to hit not baked into the standard terrain rules in the game might not be the worst thing in the world. It affected the different armies in Warhammer 40k really quite differently, particularly for orcs hitting on ballistic skill 5+. Dense cover would half the amount of damage that they'd expect to get out of their guns, whereas for a ballistic skill 3+ Space Marine, you'd only take off a quarter of it. Maybe just isn't the most helpful to have a terrain class in the game that is just massively more impactful to certain armies than others. Obviously orcs are kind of meant to be bad shots, but that's already baked in on the ballistic skill characteristic. It's just kind of hard to balance a game if some armies are going to be massively more impacted than others. Looks like in 10th edition it's just going to be all +1 to your saving throw for the benefit of cover. It's still going to help out certain armies far more than others, generally tends to be better for high save units, but at least with a bit less AP in the game it should at least be fairly relevant on just about every army. As well as dense cover, it also looks like heavy cover and set to defend have also gone. That's the +1 to save in melee that you got across certain terrain things like barricades, plus the option to get +1 to hit in the fight phase, or potentially better Overwatch when you're manning certain defensive pieces of terrain. Not really too surprised to see these removed, to be honest. It just seems like they either very rarely came up, or weren't often remembered when they might have done. Seems like terrain is mainly going to be focusing on shooting rules for the most part. Otherwise, besides things removed, we've also got changes. First up, most things are now going to be giving the +1 to save light cover benefit, this one now just called benefit of cover full stop. As mentioned, this is usually going to be more powerful on high save things. Say for example, if you had a Space Marine Terminator with a save of 2+, if you get hit by a las cannon, you're still going to be saving on a 4+ with cover. Compared with say a lower save Guardsman, where if you get a las cannon, you're not going to get a save either way, regardless of the cover or not. It does seem though that Games Workshop felt that the benefit of cover was maybe helping out certain units just a bit more than they'd like. It seems that as a result they look like they've trimmed down the single most powerful version of it, specifically on just one saving throw change, on save 3+ units against AP0 attacks. This specific combination can't be used to get, say, a Space Marine saving throw up to a 2+, when it would usually be 3. This really is pretty massive for Space Marine units. It means that standard intercessors and sisters of battle and things like that, they just won't really care about being in cover or not, at least against some of the enemy's small arms. Excluding it does feel kind of a bit weird and arbitrary. I guess they just made the decision that this was perhaps the most single excessive benefit of cover that you could get, and perhaps one of the biggest things that hurt their AP system. I feel like maybe it affects sisters just a little bit more than it does Space Marines, as only having toughness 3 is perhaps a bit worse for being targeted by mass small arms. Overall though, probably is a small effective nerf to anything with a 3+ armor save. It's kind of interesting that they do say that this applies to things with a 3+ save or better, but 2+ save units won't really be affected by this. If they're saving against an AP0 attack, then they're saving on a 2+ anyway. It doesn't matter whether they get the plus or minus. And it is interesting that 2+ armor save units saving against AP-1 still get counted for this, even if that's effectively a similar sort of buff to the 3+ save 1 against AP0. Overall though, definitely an interesting change. Will make small arms just a bit more relevant against the entire field, I think, and weirdly means that cover might not always be all it's cracked up to be for things like Space Marine units. Then to actually hand out the benefit of cover to a bunch of lucky units, we have the different terrain types. Going through in order previewed, first up we have Craters and Rubble. These ones are simplified to just giving the benefit of cover for infantry only. A +1 to your saves whether or not they partially obscure the model or not, and seems fair enough to have that locked to smaller targets I suppose. I kind of wonder if things like beasts and swarms will just be consolidated into the infantry keyword, as otherwise I would have expected them to be listed here. A lot of the 9th edition terrain rules quite frequently refer to infantry, beasts and swarms. It also looks like these aren't going to give any sort of debuff to charging now, it would seem. Previously they had a -2 inch to the movement and the charging, but now it looks like that doesn't seem to be the case. Looks like terrain isn't particularly going to be slowing down the troops as they make their way over the battlefield. I think I feel a little bit more mixed about that change, to be honest. I did think that it was quite an interesting way of making them good positions to take up and could potentially give you advantages, but also could slow the unit down and might be ones to avoid if you wanted to advance quickly. Next up we've got the Barricades, which are broadly unchanged. These are things like Aegis defense lines or pipelines and things, a combination of 2 different rules. Enemies within 1 inch of them can be charged and fought at greater than 2 inches away, provided you're fighting across the barricade. Basically just some melee tweaks to ensure that you can fight across the barrier as opposed to having to move into base contact. For shooting as well, they also grant cover to infantry that are within 3 inches of the barricade and also behind it, partially obscured to any firing model in the unit that targets them. No really major changes to their 9th edition wording that I can see. Looks like they won't be having the heavy cover and set to defend as mentioned before, so won't actually offer that much protection in combat, and the wording on the whole targeting thing is a bit simpler, no more drawing a 1mm line clause to it now. I guess they will have to define what's in line of sight and how to draw line of sight to things elsewhere in the book though they would have had to do that anyway. Next up we've got battlefield debris, so things like statues and plasma generators and stuff like that. This one's now super simple, it just grants cover to a unit if it partially obscures a model to any model in the firing unit. This one seems kind of similar to the old obstacle rule but a bit more powerful now. There's no requirements to be within 3 inches of the piece to get the terrain benefit, at least not listed here, and there's no requirements to be infantry beasts or swarms. It looks like vehicles can take effect as well. In general, this does seem at least fairly powerful. If you can get, say, a big vehicle at least partly obscured by part of this, and then an enemy unit tries to take aim at them, provided at least one of the models can't entirely see it, you get cover. It looks like this sort of thing, it might be a bit more impactful against enemy squads than big vehicles, where I'd guess you'd be able to draw a line of sight from any point on the model. Again though, this maybe isn't a class that's quite as common on tournament style competitive tables, not compared with things like ruins maybe. My instincts would probably be to treat this for big bits of debris. I probably wouldn't be treating every single barrel like this, that just seems like it would be a bit excessive. Next up we've got an interesting class called Hills and Sealed Structures. Previously in 9th edition the hills were generally considered just part of the table, and the sealed structures might just give you cover saves similar to ruins. It looks like the old rules of things like units being hull down over a hill might come into a bit more effect once more, as again this one seems to be a carbon copy of the previous debris rule. It grants cover to a unit if your model is partially obscured to any one model in the firing unit. Again, like those obstacles, looks like it could be kind of powerful to park a big vehicle behind a hill now. Depending on exactly how the line of sight rules are written, it sounds like you might still be able to draw essentially clear line of sight to enemy units over the hill, but potentially if you had, say, a big vehicle like a repulsor that was partially obscured, you might still be able to gain cover yourself. Next up we have woods. These ones are perhaps the most changed terrain piece I think. These ones grant the benefit of cover to models that are either wholly within the woods, or you can only see them through or over the woods, provided they don't either have the towering or aircraft keywords. I guess the towering keyword is probably going to be similar to the Titanic one as it is now, and apply to big things like knights. Compared with previously, perhaps this isn't enormously different to how dense cover was handed out to other units. You got it if you were in the terrain piece, and also the woods cast a bit of a shadow backwards, so if you're within that shadow, again you can still get cover. You're a lot more likely to get it though if your opponent can't see around it, so still being as close as possible to the woods gives you more chance of being able to get that extra save now. Otherwise, woods still aren't going to be hard barriers like ruins and granting obscuring. Due to having holes in and gaps in trees and stuff, you'll still likely be able to see and fire through to units that you can see. They'll just get the cover save rather than a -1 to hit, and as with the craters and rubbles and things, you don't get a -2 inch to movement anymore, so they're going to be a bit easier to take up firing positions in them and not add protection to charges. Finally, lastly, and perhaps the single most important bit of terrain for Warhammer 40k, bombed out ruins seem to be all over the galaxy on most tables, and again I'd say that these broadly function similar to how they were before, plus get a new rule called Plunging Fire. Firstly, and not actually written on the graphic for this one, though confirmed in free text in the article, it does say that they still completely block line of sight to people trying to fire through their footprints, so again a fancy window modelled onto the ruin or something like that isn't suddenly going to mean that you can shoot an entire unit if the unit is out the other side of the ruin. As before with maybe the slightly unclearly worded obscuring terrain rules, any units that are actually inside the footprint of the ruin can still see enemies out of it and still can be attacked within it. The blocking line of sight thing still sounds like it just applies to units that you're actually firing at that are fully behind the ruin. I'll be honest, I'm really glad that this stayed. If they just removed all this line of sight blocking stuff, then we might have been going back to the shooting galleries of 8th edition. Otherwise it looks like there's another couple of minor tweaks to ruins. Again, any melee type rules are removed, and in terms of actually gaining cover from the ruins, it now seems to gain the benefit of cover, models have to be wholly within the confines of the ruined terrain piece. Previously, infantry and the like could just be partially within the ruins, so have their base tagging the ruin, but not actually wholly within or around the base. Means that the +1 cover save might just be a little bit harder to acquire for models in and around ruins. They might not all fit. It also looks like if you can fit units entirely within ruins, you will now also be able to get that +1 save on vehicles and monster units as well. Really quite a big deal, so you might be able to get certain tanks or small monsters the ability to have +1 to their saves. Really quite good, as they usually tend to have quite high saves. I guess you would need quite a big ruin to set them up in though. If they have to be wholly within, then their bases and things tend to be quite big. There's likely to be a bit of overhang unless there's loads of room. Finally, they've got this rule called Plunging Fire. This one applies to any units that have set up in the ruin and are greater than 6 inches off the ground. If they shoot at any units on ground level, then they get an extra AP -1. So potentially an intercessor bolt rifle, if they're set up very high in the ruin, will be AP -2 against, say, some Chaos Space Marines on the ground. Kind of an interesting little damage buff that incentivizes actually using the top floor of ruins, which often you might not want to put units in. I feel like that's quite a fun and fluffy rule. We have seen a few different variants of that in different 40k game modes over the years. This one's going to depend quite a bit on the actual terrain available to you though. 6 inches off the ground is going to be quite high for a lot of standard Games Workshop ruins. I do quite like the cinematics of that one though. Might mean that tall ruins in your own deployment zone could be kind of interesting for gunline units. Might be particularly useful for anything that can set up there and can fire out of line of sight. The extra AP will be very nice indeed. Overall, I think it's broadly good changes for 40k terrain though. I must admit I'm not super bothered about seeing the back of things like melee terrain rules and dense cover. The system seems fairly simple and intuitive now, and affects all armies pretty evenly. I feel like perhaps taking the edge of 3+ armor save advantage in this sort of terrain maybe isn't the worst decision in the world. Otherwise, the vast majority of the rules seem like they're very clearly written now, a bit less open for interpretation or hard to get your head around. Definitely a big win for people coming to the game fresh. In any case, let me know your thoughts as always. What do you make of the 40k terrain rules? And do you think that the new system is better or worse than 9th edition? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I will try and cover any news and updates of 10th, and I do tend to post videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and if you'd like to help keep these videos coming, you can support down there if you'd like to. It's linked down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.